Sure, the banjo still makes folks dance out in the country.
Well, then, Pete, what are you doing here in New York City?
Well, it's a funny thing, but people in this big town are beginning to like my kind of music, too.
For generations of Americans, Pete Seeger was the voice that made us rise up singing. Forefather of the 60s folk music renaissance, he brought us to our feet clapping and swaying to the rapture of an eclectic and all-embracing camp revival. Now in the autumn of his years, Pete is receiving long-delayed appreciation for his immense contribution to American music and culture. A Pied Piper to both youthful rebels and aging iconoclasts, in his middle years he also stirred fierce opposition for his uncompromising stands on a host of social and political issues. In the 50s, he was blacklisted by the House Un-American Activities Committee, banned from appearing in the mainstream media, and consigned to singing for his supper in summer camps. Then in the 60s, history turned his way as he led a decade-long folk fest that became the soundtrack for the social movements that shook our nation's conscience. Frustrated with a war hauntingly reminiscent of our own, in which his country sank neck-deep in the Big Muddy, he turned his attention in his later years to cleaning up the Hudson River that flowed by his upstate New York homestead. In the intimate conversation that follows, a special edition of A World of Possibilities, Pete Seeger recalls it all through the prism of mellowed memory. His personal reflections on his life, times, and his country's future are laced with the sounds of his now quavering but still stirring voice and his eternally tuneful banjo. Join us for the next hour as we hear a classic affirmation of human possibilities from the stubbornly hopeful spirit of an altogether American original.
If you love this land of the free,
bring 'em home, bring 'em home.
Bring all troops back from overseas.
First of all, you came from a family that came over on the Mayflower or sometime around then, and in many ways it was a very patrician family, but at the same time it was a family of dissenters and pacifists as well. How did that mix of backgrounds reflect itself in the way you chose to live your life?
I remember starting to read when I was very young, and a nature writer named Ernest Thompson Seton became my guru. I read every one of his books, Wild Animals I Have Known, Rolfe in the Woods, and so on. He held up the American Indians, Native Americans, as an example of people who were honest and brave and shared everything they had. And I built myself a teepee at age 10 and learned to camp out in it, and I could even cook my meals on a tiny fire inside the teepee. Then I became a teenager and started reading Henry David Thoreau, and pretty soon I was reading socialists and communists. In college, I became a member of the Young Communist League. And Woody Guthrie and I, we met when I was 20 years old. An extraordinary man, absolutely extraordinary. He'd hitchhiked into New York in the month of February, and with his thumb stuck out in the February winds, he was making up the verses which everybody knows now. As I was walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway. I saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. We both considered ourselves communists. In the deepest sense of the word, we didn't take assignments on going out to meetings here and there. However, I drifted out around 1950 when I moved up to the country, and I felt that all this secrecy was not a good thing. You got to be open and frank about your opinions, even if you can't get the kind of job you'd like.
You know, why it's interesting, because if you had been in the Soviet Union, do you think you would have actually been a communist, or do you think you would have been one of those dissidents who would have ended up in a gulag?
Probably the latter, I'm not sure. I visited the Soviet Union not once, but 3 times. Once in 1964, my wife and I took our 3 children out of school and spent 11 months traveling around the world. And in a sense, I sang for our supper across the Pacific in Japan, where we got to see my wife's relatives. Her father joined us there. He hadn't seen his relatives for 50 years. And then Europe East as well as Europe West. And I could see some things I liked, but I saw some other things I didn't like. And over the years, I could see that any country that doesn't have some kind of freedom of expression, either freedom of the press or freedom of the air, or simply the ability to get a batch of people together and express some wild idea, any country that does not have that is sooner or later going to be in trouble, whether the people in power are religious or atheist or whatever they are. I often quote the German communist Rosa Luxemburg. She spent World War I in jail because she was against the war. The Kaiser, however, was kicked out and she was let out of jail. 6 months later, she writes a letter, "Dear Comrade Lenin, I hear you have censorship of the press and you restrict the right of people to freely assemble and express their opinion. Don't you realize that in a few years all the decisions in your country will be made by a few elite, and the masses will only be called in to dutifully applaud your decisions?" Of course, it's exactly what happened. I think if it hadn't been Stalin, it would have been somebody else.
Was there something inherent to the communist idea that somehow led in the direction of totalitarianism, or was it just that a particular group of people seized hold of it and hold of the values and principles and subverted it towards their own ends?
There's always the danger that a group of people who think they agree with each other don't speak up, even if people think they're wrong. There's a whole batch of communists living in the Hudson Valley that I know very well. A batch of them came over to sing at one of our festivals. They're Christian communists. They date back to the days of the peasant wars in Germany. Jakob Hutter burnt at the stake in the year 1535. And they call themselves Hutterites or Hutterians. And nobody has one penny to their name. If you need clothing or food or a book or a picture to hang on the wall, you go to the committee and see if you can get it. You usually get what you need. They're not farmers. They run a very successful small business. Ever heard of community playthings? They make blocks for nursery schools. Every week, trucks pull up with high-grade lumber, and every week, trucks pull away with high-grade merchandise sold all around the country. Community playthings. Well, they're Christian communists. And I remember once visiting a little kibbutz in Israel where nobody, again, had a penny to their name. They were making things out of aluminum, which were sold all around through Europe and elsewhere. And it was an interesting place. Amusingly enough, they said they rarely married within the community because when they said you grow up with everybody in the community like one family, you need a little mystery for romance. They usually married outside the community from another kibbutz, and some of them married Arabs. They were, I guess, a left-wing kibbutz.
So communism is not something that was solely the province of Marxists and of...
oh, no.
And you were more attracted to the communism that was not of large enterprises and the monolithic state, but more of a communalism.
That's right, sharing. Of course, this you might consider that anthropologists agree that all our ancestors, if you go back far enough, were communists. They lived in small tribes and shared what they had. On the other hand, a neighboring tribe was a potential enemy, and they had to sit around a council fire and argue, do we stay here and starve, or do we invade our neighbor's hunting ground and face a fight to the death? Well, now we're in a situation where if we don't talk with each other, all around the world. There won't be any world here. There won't be any human race here. I guess you know Kurt Vonnegut, the great writer, thought we had a chance of a snowball in hell surviving the 21st century. Have you ever read Cat's Cradle?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, you know what? On the other hand, I'm actually more optimistic now than I was right after Hiroshima. When it sunk through my skull what the atom bomb meant, I felt sure that somebody was going to drop one within a few decades, and if we weren't killed, we'd be poisoned by the fallout. But Eisenhower's people would not let General Curtis LeMay start World War III. He was really trying to. He was playing chicken with the Russians, like flying a squadron of planes at the border, and he'd have cameras on the border. And if even one Russian plane had crossed the border before he got there, he'd have kept on going. But they were sensible enough not to. So before he got to the border, all the planes just swooped up in the air and went back home. And Eisenhower's people said, don't do this anymore. During the Bay of Pigs, he had about 100 planes in the air with hydrogen bombs on them and messages to all the pilots saying, communication with Washington may be cut off. If it is, take your orders directly from me. And when Kennedy's people found he'd done that, they said, don't do that again. When he died in 1990, he was still grumbling, we would have been better off if we'd had World War III in 1954.
But the fact that it didn't happen, in your view, is reason for optimism.
Exactly. On the other hand, there's insane, power-hungry people all around the world. And my father, who was an old professor of musicology, in his 90 years old, he became deeply pessimistic. He'd been over-optimistic first about this and about that and about something else. But at age 90, he said, Peter, I can't persuade the scientists I know that they have the most dangerous religious belief in the world. And the scientist I'm talking to says, Charlie, I don't have a religious belief. I base my actions on observation, double-checked worldwide, as all science should be, and then draw logical conclusions. Oh, no, I tell them, says my father, haven't you observed the insane, power-hungry people in the world? Is it logical to put in their hands the ability to destroy the world? And the scientist, but you're attacking all science. If I didn't do this, if I didn't discover these things, somebody else would. And I tell them, yes, if you didn't rape this woman, somebody else would, so why not? They stagger away saying, you've no right to ask questions like this. And I shout after them, says my father, face it, it's a religious belief. You think that an infinite increase in empirical information is a good thing. Can you prove it? Of course you can't. Because then he turned to me with a wry smile, this was 30 years ago, and said, Peter, of course, if I'm right, perhaps the committee that told Galileo to shut up was correct. All you do is On the other hand, if he was here, I'd argue with him. I'd say, Father, remember the great German philosopher Hegel? He says there is always thesis, there is always antithesis, there is always synthesis. And the synthesis is in the song Turn, Turn, Turn. There's a time for good and bad at different times. Once upon a time, all our ancestors had to be good killers. The ones who were not good killers didn't have descendants. On the other hand, as I say, now we face a different situation. We got to draw upon our ability to talk with each other even if we disagree. And if we do learn this, who knows? There may still be a human race here in 100 years.
You know, you are profoundly, I've always felt in your music and in your bearing that despite every kind of disappointment, frustration, and in many cases, attack and persecution, you have remained fundamentally optimistic about human possibilities. Where does that come from in you?
I don't know. I'm very lucky to have been born with good health. And at age 88, I can still go out and chop wood and dig ditches, keep my road from washing out when a thunderstorm comes. And that's probably part of it. Partly, of course, is also being married to an extraordinary woman who stuck with me in spite of all the crazy things I was doing. She's had a lifelong joke. She says, if Peter would only chase other women, I'd have an excuse to leave him.
You're listening to Pete Seeger in this special edition of A World of Possibilities. Up next, Pete recalls the music that gave cadence and courage to the 60s civil rights movement.
You know, segregation bound to fall, da-da-da-da-da-da. And people were improvising new verses to it. A woman saw me writing them down. She says, don't you know you can't write down freedom songs? They're different every time you hear them.
This is A World of Possibilities. To hear the podcast of this program and to hear the show archives, please visit our website at aworldofpossibilities.com or visit iTunes.
To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And a time to every purpose under heaven. Time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to reap, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to...
Tell me about why you not just went to music. Of course, your father was a musicologist, but you went not to sort of high culture music. You went to the people's music. In fact, you did much to promote the people's music and were in some ways the father of the folk revival. Why did you choose to do it at that level? Was it Woody Guthrie in part who influenced you?
Partly, it was more specifically, it was a young Texan whose father, exactly 100 years ago, put out a book of cowboy songs. John Lomax was his name, and he, with pencil in hand, he'd sit around a campfire and write down the ballads being sung by some cowboy. And he showed them to the professor in Texas. They said, this is just doggerel, throw it away. But a few years later, he's up in Harvard, and Professor Kittredge says, oh, no, this is American folk music. You should write it down. And in 1907, he got President Theodore Roosevelt to write a short foreword to the book saying, these are good songs, people should sing them. His son, Alan, came along in 1934. He said to his father, I want to carry on your work. And now the Library of Congress, during the New Deal days, got a little money to pay somebody to be in charge of the Archive of American Folk Song. And Alan had the self-confidence of youth, and he'd call up Mr. Paley, head of Columbia Broadcasting System, say, Mr. Paley, this is Alan Lomax in charge of the Archive of American Folk Song. I think you should devote the School of the Air 1 year to American folk music. We'll have old Sailor John come up from Sailor's Snug Harbor and sing one of the old sea shanties. And then we'll have a composer like Aaron Copland arrange it for the CBS Symphony. And if we can't locate old Sailor John or somebody like him to sing a song, I've got a young fella here named Pete Seeger. He can sing the song. So Alan would show me the book, said, Pete, you have to learn this and be on the air with it next week.
And you did it?
I did it, and I also listened to not hundreds but thousands of country songs because recording machines had been invented, and now a man named Ralph Peer would take a recording machine to some hotel down to the south, maybe Knoxville, Tennessee, and put an advertisement in the local newspaper saying, if you can fiddle or pick a banjo or sing some song, for anyone I accept, I'll pay $25. Well, that seemed like a month's wages for somebody in those days. And there'd be a line of people outside his hotel room. They called it the Hillbilly Catalog in those days. There was also a race catalog for African Americans. And Alan had me listening to these old early commercial records. I have to confess, though, I'm of two minds about recordings. I guess I'm of two minds about almost everything in the world. But I keep remembering what John Philip Sousa, the great band leader who wrote, he says, what will happen to the American voice now the phonograph has been invented? And it's true. Families used to sing around the supper table. Men used to sing in bars. Mothers would sing lullabies to their babies. Now it's not anywhere near so common. I guess it's my basic, really very basic philosophy that the world needs participation, whether it's in family life or in musical life or in political life. And without that participation, any country will make a lot of mistakes. I really don't think much of a country where a small handful of people make all the decisions.
Well, you know, the civil rights movement, of course, was, and later the anti-war movement, but the civil rights movement in particular, all the sit-ins and marches were animated by music that gave people courage.
I tell people it was the singingest movement this country ever knew. They sang impromptu in the morning, in the afternoon, the evening. They singing on marches and singing in jail, singing on picket lines, and there were new songs being made up every week. My wife and I were on the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. And the hit song of that march was a song written by a teenager driving a truck, and he had been listening to a rock and roll tune, and before he finished, after he got where he was going, he'd put new words to it. Oh, Wallace, you never can jail us. Oh, Wallace, you know segregation bound to fall. Da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, I read it in the papers, da-da-da-da-da-da. The other day, da-da-da-da-da-da. The freedom fighters, da-da-da-da-da-da, are on their way, da-da-da-da-da-da. They're coming by bus, da-da-da-da-da-da, by airplane too, da-da-da-da-da-da. They'll even walk, da-da-da-da-da-da, if you ask them to, da-da-da-da-da-da. Oh, Wallace, you never can jail us. Oh, Wallace, you know segregation bound to fall. Da-da-da-da-da-da. And people were improvising new verses to it. A woman saw me writing them down. She says, don't you know you can't write down freedom songs? They're different every time you hear them.
There's another one. If you don't find me at the back of the bus, if you don't find me nowhere, come on over to the courthouse. We'll be singing up there. Come on over to the courthouse.
If you miss me at the back of the bus, you can't find me nowhere. Come on over to the front of the bus. I'll be riding up there. I'll be riding up there. I'll be riding up there. Come on over to the front of the bus. I'll be riding up there. If you miss me on the picket line, you can't find me nowhere. Come on over to the courthouse. I'll be voting right there.
Right, that's right. You know, you are credited with such a number of songs that have become anthems that go, I mean, I've seen them sung in situations that you would have turned over and turned the other way. We Shall Overcome. You brought it up from an old spiritual. What's the story there?
Well, way back in the 19th century, there was a gospel song, usually sung rather fast. I'll be all right. I'll be all right. I'll be all right someday. If in my heart I do believe I'll be all right someday. Another verse is, I'll be like him. I'll be like him. I'll wear the crown. I'll wear the crown. Another verse was, I'll overcome. I'll overcome. And Then union people made a union verse out of it. In fact, I've seen a copy of the United Mine Workers Journal of February 1909. And a writer says, at our union meetings last year, we started off every meeting with a prayer and singing that good old song, We Will Overcome. So they changed the words back then. Then in 1946, a group of tobacco workers were on strike, this time in Charleston, South Carolina, and one woman liked to sing the song very slowly. In gospel churches, you can sing a gospel song fast or slow. And this woman, her name was Lucille Simmons, liked to sing it very, very slow. And she sang, We will overcome. We will overcome. This gives a chance for the basses to harmonize, and the tenors and the altos all get harmony. And a white woman, a union organizer, learned it from them, and she taught it to me way back in 1946. However, I didn't know how to sing it that slowly, didn't have her good voice. I tried to sing it fast, but it never went anywhere. I didn't really sing it much. But a young friend of mine, Guy Carawan is his name, and his friend Frank Hamilton, they learned the song too, and they had been learning gospel songs in Los Angeles, way out there. And there's a kind of rhythm that musicians call 12-8 time. You still have 4 beats, 1, 2, 3, 4, but you divide up every beat into 3 short beats. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. So on. That way, they taught it when a guy got a job east in a little tiny union labor school called Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. And I was there one weekend when he taught it to about 70 young people. And it was the hit song of the weekend. 5 weeks later, the organization called SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, SNCC for short. They've had their founding convention in North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, and somebody shouted to Guy Carawan, Guy, teach us all we shall overcome. Well, it was the hit of the weekend, and they started that way of crossing your hands in front of you, so your left hand reaches to your right and grasps the right hand of the person to your right, and your right hand crosses in front of you to your left and grasps the left hand to the person to your left. Well, a month later, it wasn't a song, it was the song all around the South, from Texas to Virginia to Florida. And 3 years later, in 1963, I was fortunate to have a concert in Carnegie Hall, New York City, and the record company recorded the whole audience helping me out with this song, and it was the only record I ever made which sold very much. Most of my records were lucky if they sold 10 or 20,000 copies. But this record sold 500,000 or more, and it went around the world.
This is a world of possibilities. If you wish to contact us, please direct emails to comments@aworldofpossibilities.com. This program is distributed by the WFMT Radio Network.
As our special conversation with folk legend Pete Seeger continues, Pete walks us through the genesis of one of his most haunting and memorable melodies.
These 3 short lines were printed. Where are the flowers? The girls have plucked them. Where are the girls? They're all married. Where are the men? They're all in the army. And I said to myself, I should look up that song. It sounds interesting.
Where have all the flowers gone? Long time passing. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time ago. Where have all the flowers gone? The young girls picked them unto husbands, everyone. When will they ever learn?
When will they ever learn?
13 years ago, my grandson and I were singing in India, and we were in a small little village where they couldn't speak English, but the man recognized me because my picture had been on the Calcutta newspaper. And he says, Pete Seeger. He didn't know how to pronounce my name. And he gets his 5-year-old granddaughter and sings me We Shall Overcome in the Bengali language.
Well, yes. I mean, I that is really one of the anthems of humanity at this point. That's not an American folk song anymore. And when you tell me this story, I see that a true folk song, not one that's invented for commercial use, but a true folk song is the work of many, many voices over time in many different circumstances.
My father, the musicologist, says, don't argue, is it a folk song or not? It's a waste of time. Just know that the folk process has been going on for thousands, for all we know, tens of thousands of years, and produces many, many different kinds of songs. You might even say that the most popular American folk music of the last half century has been electric rock and roll, and a good musician like Jimi Hendrix will put out some things which other people want to do similar. Who knows?
It's interesting because you did Turn, 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 and then the Byrds did it. It became a sort of a pop song after you did it. And of course, Where Have All the Flowers Gone became another one of those that spun out into the world.
Incidentally, I didn't make that song up all by myself. I was reading a great Russian novel called And Quiet Flows the Don.
Oh, right.
The Don is a river. And on one page it printed 3 lines of a song. The Cossacks are galloping off to join the Tsar's army way back in the 19th century. And they're singing. And these 3 short lines were printed. Where are the flowers? The girls have plucked them. Where are the girls? They're all married. Where are the men? They're all in the army. And I said to myself, I should look up that song. It sounds interesting. But I never got around to. Meanwhile, I was riding in an airplane on my way to sing at Oberlin College in Ohio. And all of a sudden, I got a tune. I didn't know then where the tune came from. And 20 minutes later, I had 3 verses of a song. A young fellow, a student, had a job at a summer camp 6 months later, and he taught the song to the kids, and they were kidding around with it. Where have all the counselors gone? Broken curfew, everyone. But by the end of the summer, he'd added the 2 verses, where have all the soldiers gone and where have all the graveyards gone? And the kids took the song to New York in the fall, and Peter, Paul, and Mary learned it from him. They thought it was an old folk song, and they started singing it, and the Kingston Trio got it. My manager said to me, Pete, didn't you write a song called Where Have All the Flowers Gone? I said, yeah, 3 or 4 years ago, I think. He said, did you ever copyright it? No, I guess I didn't. He said, well, you ought to. The Kingston Trio just recorded it. I called up Dave Guard. He was an old friend of mine. He'd gotten started because I mimeographed a little book on how to play the banjo way, way back in it was 1948. I mimeographed 100 copies, and it took me 4 years to sell those. But then I got 500 more copies printed. Again, they sold in 4 years. Well, he got one of those early copies and started playing the banjo. On the phone, he said, oh, Pete, we didn't know it was your song. We'll take our name off it. It was very nice of him because legally I had, as they say, abandoned copyright. Then a friend of mine, Ernie Mars, a wonderful songwriter, a part Indian, part Native American fellow from California, and Oklahoma too. He started off in Oklahoma and in New Mexico. He says, Pete, do you remember you were singing a lumberjack song, Irish lumberjack song from the North Woods? Johnson says he'll load more hay, says he'll load 10 times a day. Well, all I did was slow it down, and I had a tune.
So all the influences come from many places. Are there any songs of today that you find particularly fetching?
Well, there's now dozens, not hundreds. There are thousands of young people making up songs now, and some of them absolutely fantastic. Two women, they call themselves Emma's Revolution, harking back to Emma Goldman. Pat Humphrey and her partner Sandy Oboteau, they have a song called Swimming to the Other Side. We are living in the great big dipper. We are washed by the very same rain. We are swimming in the sea together, some in power and some in pain. Isn't that an extraordinary line?
Yeah, it is.
Some in power and some in pain.
Mm-hmm.
We can worship this ground we walk on, we're cherishing the beings we live beside. Loving spirits will live forever. We're all swimming to the other side. And it just flows off your tongue, this extraordinary refrain, and audiences want to sing along with them.
You were credited with being, in some ways, the father of the folk revival that happened from the late 50s through the 60s very strongly.
No, I look upon myself as a link in a chain. Woody Guthrie was probably the most important link. Alan Lomax also. I've just had a longevity. Here I am, 88, still singing, or at least pretending I'm singing, getting others singing with me. And the songs I'm singing are, some of them may be centuries old. I really mean it. Nobody knows where, but somewhere back in England, I think, somebody wrote a song. Was an old farmer lived over the hill. If he ain't moved out, he's living there still, singing I-di, yiddle-lo-fi, diddle-I, diddle-I day. The devil come up to him one day, said, one of your family I'm gonna take away, singing I-di, yiddle-I-fi, diddle-I, diddle-I day. Oh, please don't take my eldest son. There's work on the farm and it's got to be done, singing. It goes on. The devil picks her up upon his back and off to hell he goes, clickety-clack. He carries her down to the gates of hell, says, poke up the fire, we'll scorch her well. But 9 little devils went climbing up the wall, saying, take her back, Daddy, she'll murder us all. Because there were 2 little devils with ball and chain. Up with her foot, she kicks out their brains. Oh, I got up next morning, I spied through a crack, I seen the old devil come a-dragging her back, singing, I-di, diddle-I-fi, diddle-I, diddle-I day. Said, here's your wife, both sound and well, if I'd kept her there longer, she'd have drawn up hell. I-di, diddle-I day, diddle-I, diddle-I day. This only goes to show what a woman can do, she can whoop out the devil and her husband too, singing, I-di, diddle-I day. Diddle-I, diddle-I, so on. So you mix them up.
So when the folk revival began, it was like almost as it was like your children, because you had, in the 50s, you had sung after you were blacklisted. You sang to kids in summer camps and in schools, and those kids grew up and became in some ways inspired by the music.
Actually, I'm quite proud. I opened up the college concert field. In the late 50s, I'd just go from one college to another and sing for a few hundred here and a few hundred there. The John Birch Society would try and picket me, but all they did was give me free publicity and sell more tickets. I remember I was singing it for about 300 people in the University of Wisconsin, and I think the year was 1958, and Bob Dylan told me he was there. He'd come down from Minnesota.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, so it caught on in a very big way in the 60s, and many people said that it was the music that made the movement more than any rhetoric. And I must say, as a participant in those times, that I found the music more hopeful and inspiring than the politics, because the music seemed to capture hearts at a completely different level. What is it about the folk music of that time that animated?
Well, there's a whole book on the subject of the power of music. What is Sachs? Oliver Sacks.
Yes.
And I haven't finished reading it yet, but he points out that throughout history, music has had some unexplainable power. Plato is supposed to have said it's very dangerous to allow the wrong kind of music in the Republic. And I'm told there's an old Arab proverb saying when the king puts the poet on his payroll, he cuts off the tongue of the poet. And I think of that if I ever get a job on TV.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because there were various times during your career when it looked like you were headed straight into the middle of the mainstream. And then partly your personal principles and partly your politics would come forth and sort of sabotage that. Was that ultimately a source of regret for you, or do you feel like you were rescued from something?
In a sense, I was rescued. Now I've gotten too much publicity. My poor wife, most men chain their wives to a sink, but poor Toshi's chained to a table of paper. In fact, right now she's going through a half bushel of mail that came this morning.
Well, what was that like, actually, to be at the center of all of this for a period of time? Did you feel that people were seeing the real Pete Seeger, really you as a human being, or were they at some point lionizing you and creating something that was not the real you?
No, I was very glad to be able to keep singing, even though I couldn't get on TV. I feel myself just very, very lucky to have lived in a country where I didn't get assassinated, at least not yet. And
so you feel that for all of its deficiencies, you're glad to live in this country?
Oh, it's fascinating. This most fascinating country to live in, with the good and the bad all tangled up. I mean, some horrible things have gone on, especially in the last 7 years.
In this final segment of A World of Possibilities, a special conversation with Pete Seeger, Pete gazes into the future of our imperiled planet, and despite his better judgment, finds reason for hope.
Remember Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, saying, "Never doubt that a few committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has."
Our children numbered just about 4, and they all had sweethearts knocking on the door. They all got married and they didn't wait. I was, oh Lord, a grandmother of 8. Oh, kisses sweeter than
This is A World of Possibilities. Copies of this program are available on CD and can be requested by email at comments@aworldofpossibilities.com.
Now we are old and ready to go, thinking about what happened a long time ago.
we had lots of kids in trouble and pain, but oh Lord, we do it again. Oh, kisses sweeter than wine.
As you look back on the 60s, that moment of sort of explosive epiphanies and but also great disappointments and frustration, what do you think is the legacy of that time for today?
You never can tell. That's what it is. And people who claim they know what's going to happen usually get fooled. Whether they're religious or non-religious, the right or the left, whether it was the anti-war protests or the civil rights movement, Americans have learned that even every little bit counts. And this is the subject of the book that I'm recommending everybody read now. It's called Blessed Unrest by a small businessman, Paul Hawken. Smith & Hawken tools are famous with gardeners. They make very good tools. And Paul Hawken figures he spoke at 1,000 places in the last 15 years and finally makes a book out of his basic beliefs. The subtitle is, How Did the Largest Movement in the World Come So Quickly and Nobody Predicted Its Coming? What is this movement? It does not have a name and will not have a name. These are people who say, gee, I want to do something, usually in my home community. Whether they are peaceniks or eco-niks or civil rights types, save this, stop that. There are 800 community gardeners in Manhattan now, and an umbrella organization that shows them how they must work with the park department, or else sooner or later the developers will bulldoze their garden. But if they work with the park department, they get a name, they get a number, and perhaps a fence, and their whole neighborhood's improved. New York City is a much nicer place than it was 30 years ago.
I agree with you about that. This sort of fits with what you're saying about you very much support participation at a very basic level. That's the core of who you are, whether it's singing or doing other things together. And is that one of the legacies of the 60s, even though the 60s didn't necessarily
Yes, I would say one of the things, they made some mistakes, like having a huge Woodstock festival where somebody got killed because it wasn't organized quite safely enough. On the other hand, that song written by my friend Country Joe McDonald, that was the hit song of 1971. 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gate. There ain't no time to wonder why, whoopee, we're all going to die. And this sarcasm just reached across all borders.
How come there isn't that kind of music now during the Iraq War?
Well, there's some songs like it, but I know in my own singing, I mention Iraq, but I sing a song like oh, wait a minute. One blue sky above us, one ocean lapping all our shore, one earth so green and round, who could ask for more? I get audiences singing that with me everywhere I go. We realize that we all got to work together like never before on global warming and the oceans rising.
It's very interesting you say that, because in the 60s it was more about particular groups like the civil rights movement and then the anti-war movement, and it was anti-movements. Now we have something called global warming that, as you say, is really about everyone. Do you see this, and you yourself turned towards local environmentalism after the 60s, cleaning up the Hudson with your sloop, the Clearwater, and singing, and with great success. But are we headed into a period now where something like global warming, as well as many other things, is turning into a kind of perfect storm that's either going to break us or make us as a human community?
You're right. The oceans rising may be a wake-up call for the entire human community, as you call them. And I really would like to zero in on this. I think if there's a human race here in 100 years, it's going to be tens of millions of small things which will save us. I often tell I have a kind of a parable I taught. Imagine a big seesaw, and one end of that seesaw is on the ground because it got a great big basket half full of rocks. The other end of the seesaw is up in the air. It's only a quarter full of sand, but some of us got teaspoons and we're trying to fill it. A lot of people are laughing at us. They said, people like you have been trying for centuries, but it's leaking out of that basket as fast as you're putting in. But I said, we know you're wrong. It wasn't quite a quarter full. Now it's a little more than a quarter full. And we're getting more people with teaspoons all the time. And we think that one of these years, that whole seesaw will go zoop in the other direction, and people will say, gee, how did it happen so suddenly? Us and all our little teaspoons. And it's not just me talking like this or Paul Hawken talking like this. Remember Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, saying, never doubt that a few committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And René Dubos, the great biologist, says, think globally, act locally. And E.F. Schumacher, who had a good job in charge of the coal industry in England, comes over here, quits his job, comes over here saying, small is beautiful. And who knows? God only knows what the future is going to be. But as I say, he gave us brains. If we use them, miracles can happen.
Pete, I want you to sing a song, if you would, that brought me to tears when I first heard it some years ago, that I think reflects this this sort of undying optimism in you. Quite Early Morning.
Oh, I can't sing very well, but I'll play. It's one of my favorite tunes.
And this is one of yours.
Oh. Don't you know it's darkest before the dawn? But this thought keeps me moving on. If we could heed these early warnings, the time is now quite early morning. If we could heed these early warnings, the time is now quite early morning. Some say that humankind won't long endure. What makes them feel so doggone sure? I know that you, who hear my singing, could make those freedom bells go ringing. I know that you, who hear my singing, could make those freedom bells go ringing. So we keep on while we live, no matter how, I can't remember all the words now of my own song. At any rate, it ends up saying, keep on, and we still can have singing tomorrows.
Well, Pete, this has been more than I even had hoped it would be. For me, it's just it brings the circle right around, and I enormously appreciate you giving this time.
Thank you, and thanks to all the engineers who kept us in touch.
Oh, what will you give me? Say the sad bells are ringing. Is there hope for the future? Say the brown bells of Merthyr.
You've been listening to A World of Possibilities with host Mark Summer. This program was produced and edited by Greg McVicker, with production engineers Tofu Mike Schwartz and Matt Fiddler. Music courtesy of Sony BMG Music Entertainment, Appleseed Records, Columbia Records, and Smithsonian Folkways. This program is distributed by the WFMT Radio Network. Thank you for listening.